think we're ready to go. I think we're ready to go. Good evening. I'm Rosalind Croucher. I'm President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and this is my 4th week in the job, and this is my very first Rights Talk here. So I'm absolutely delighted to have a role in the proceedings and to welcome you all to this wonderful meeting room, and also to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land in this lovely corner of Sydney. We face south and west and east, and we don't quite see the bounds of Gadigal land, but we get some sense of how beautiful this part of the world is, minus the buildings, if we can imagine it in that way. Anyway, the Human Rights Talks are an important public event in the human rights calendar of the Human Rights Commission, and it provides discussions on important human rights issues, and they're an opportunity for the general public, everybody, to come in and experience a bit of the themes and discussions around human rights issues. And in a way, they're a very practical expression of human rights as reflected in our banner line, which is everyone, everywhere, every day. And so the discussions, I think, tease out those themes about everyone, everywhere, every day. Our 2 speakers tonight both have very distinct experiences in South America. Rusty Young in Bolivia and Colombia, and Kelly Brooke Nichols in Colombia. Both have written books about their experiences, which bring them here tonight. And each of them in their works in the writings and in their work, has focused on the impact of horrifying events on people's lives and the human rights challenges involved, which is the particular theme. And commissioners, guests, staff of the Human Rights Commission, I welcome you all to participate in this discussion tonight. We're going to begin with Rusty and a focus on Bolivia. Then our attention will shift to Colombia, and we'll start that discussion with Kelly, and Rusty will contribute to that as well. There will be time for questions at the end. So, Rusty, come on in.
Thank you.
Come on down. Rusty Young is known for a variety of things. His books, which we'll speak to tonight, and he will speak about his work. But the things I'll just mention about Rusty was he grew up in Sydney, and as a good lad, he studied finance and law at the University of New South Wales. And although I was both on the staff and I did my doctorate at UNSW, our paths sadly didn't cross.
Just missed.
Just missed. We were graduations passing in the night, so to speak. But the success of his work has led him to a very rich career. So backpacking in South America on the Gringo Trail, the Lonely Planet took you to San Pedro Prison, and in a way the rest is history. So it began a conversation with Thomas McFadden that provided a rich experience of life, and I'm sure inspired you, and it's a conversation that hasn't stopped. So the book is Thomas's story, and it's written in the first person, but I'll let you talk about all of that. I was fascinated how you became involved and also how you became Thomas's international human rights lawyer, which is part of the human rights conversation tonight. So I thought I would begin. I think we're supposed to sit down and look
Where do you want to sit?
quasi-casual. Do you want to sit in the middle?
Okay, sure.
And you're mic'd already, aren't you?
I am, thank you. Can
Wonderful.
Everyone hear me up at the back? Yep.
So the book that I was referring to, the one that took you into Bolivia, Marching Powder, which has a cover similar to that one, but it's slightly different. Marching Powder, how did you get into that? And tell us about Thomas's story and the whole thing about the San Pedro Prison, which was absolutely fascinating.
So I actually studied penology and criminology at University of New South Wales, where you were an academic and graduate as well. And I was traveling with my then girlfriend, Simone Camilleri. We were just about to enter into the workforce. And we were traveling through South America just as 24-year-old backpackers, and we came across San Pedro Prison, which was listed as the world's most bizarre tourist attraction. It certainly lived up to its name. Being studious law graduates, we decided to go in there and do some field testing of the prisons. And you leave your passport at the gate, and the gate clangs shut behind you. And once you're inside, it's a fully functional male prison. The guards themselves don't go inside. They only go inside once a day to mark the roll, just make sure everyone's there. It's a really, really, truly bizarre prison. And
we may need to turn up the volume. I think there's a bit of hearing at the back that's a little bit difficult. Why don't you use one of these?
Yeah, okay. I'll grab this one. Do you want me to turn this one off?
If you can't hear, you do need to put your hand up and give a big wave.
Is that better? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. I was traveling through Bolivia with my then girlfriend, Simone Camilleri, and we came across this prison called San Pedro, which was listed in the Lonely Planet Guidebook and Footprints Guidebook as the world's most bizarre tourist attraction. You go there, you leave your passport at the gates, they shut the gate behind you, and then you're in there. The inmates don't wear uniforms, so it's very difficult to distinguish the visitors from the convicted criminals. There are women and children living inside the prison, and this is one of the human rights issues and child rights issues that really, really prompted me to become passionate about this subject. And this is not an informal system. This is Bolivian law. At the last count, there were 2,103 children living in Bolivia's national penitentiary system legally, and they've committed no crime. So there's women living in there, children living there, cats and dogs, tourists going through, Coca-Cola signs on the wall. It's actually sponsored by the South American bottler of Coca-Cola. There's no Pepsi in this particular prison. Another one of the amazing aspects of this prison is there's not enough accommodation for all the inmates. So rather than sort of fighting over it, what they do is they created a capitalist market economy for the prison cells. So it's like a real estate system whereby you actually have to purchase your own prison cell. Again, this is non-official. This is not Bolivian law, but it's certainly accepted practice, and it's actually documented. And when you go in, depending on how many people are leaving, you buy your prison cell from an outgoing inmate, and the price fluctuates according to supply and demand. There are good sections and bad sections. There's a 6-star section with convicted drug traffickers, high-level politicians who have been robbing the country for decades, and they're in a kind of a separate 6-star section, protected from the other inmates who really want to get at them for all their crimes against society. And in the 0 and 1-star section, the inmates live in absolute squalor. And if you don't have enough money to buy a cell, you can rent one. And so obviously the wealthier inmates start buying up properties and renting it out rather like Monopoly. And when you buy it, you also have to pay a transfer, just like a stamp duty. So there's overcrowding, undersupply, and stamp duty, which sounds a lot like the New South Wales state government. Sorry, did I say that? I didn't say that, Rosalind. I'm teasing. So to me, it was astounding that the Bolivian government didn't provide enough for these inmates. They had to have jobs inside there because they didn't get a uniform. All they got for food was watered down soup. They have to buy their own prison cell. And then on top of that, there's rampant corruption inside the prison with the police. Inmates at one stage, not when I was there, but the inmates at one stage were manufacturing cocaine inside the prison. They were certainly selling it out of the prison. There are lots of tourists going in there taking drugs, and obviously there's a certain infringement on the rights of the prisoners when you have tourists, like 50 or 70 tourists coming in through and taking photos and pointing at all these, pointing at the prisoners as if they're animals in a zoo. So that really piqued my interest. We paid $5 to do a tour, and then we didn't want to leave. And it was really fascinating. Then I met Thomas McFadden, who was an African-born English drug trafficker, and he became a tour guide. He couldn't speak Spanish, so he needed a job. And he started telling his stories, and tourists from all around, Western tourists who were going through South America, ended up coming into the prison, paying $5 for a tour, and then for an extra $5, you could stay the night in the prison. So I was like, oh, this sounds really dangerous. But Simone, my then girlfriend, who's over there, and has also become a dear friend and also my consultant on this next book, story consultant, literary agent, she said, we're staying. So we did. We stayed for 2 nights in this prison, and by the end, Simone had decided that I was going to write a book, and she informed me that I was writing a book. So I came back to Australia, then went back into the prison and spent 4 months living inside this prison to research it properly. And the end result was Marching Powder.
Well, it's a really gripping story, and I must say that as I was reading it, I felt it had the kind of flavour of Blade Runner. You know, this strange world with all of its own class system, its microeconomy, its own internal rules, and it's seductive on one level, but absolutely terrifying on others. So I felt that whole thing about the class system, the property transfers, all of the rules. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So there are 8 different sections, and as I said, they've all got a hotel-style rating, and each suburb, let's call it, has a different price range. So depending on what your budget is, what your income is, you can live in a good suburb or a bad suburb. The inmates, because the guards don't go in there and create the rules, they make their own rules. They post them up. They post up their own laws in each section. They hold annual democratic elections, and basically they're in charge of their own security and their own punishments as well. So the punishments might range from sweeping the patios, painting the walls, cleaning the toilets, or even that they put the own inmates put their fellow inmates in solitary confinement sometimes. And the most horrific punishment is for sex offenders and pedophiles and sex offenders. And because there are women and children living in there, they can't afford to have sex offenders in there. It's too dangerous. So they basically lynch them in a pretty horrific manner, which is described in the book. It's probably not best to go into it in public, but really horrific. So there's a mixture of extreme humanity and sort of social cohesion, but at the same time, absolute horror at times and violence.
And obviously that story of Thomas McFadden and his ups and downs and the corruption, the payoffs that were involved, and at times there are moments when he said that it was the best years of his life. There were 2 or 3 years that he described as the happiest years in his life. And I found that absolutely intriguing, but it was in the context that was so shaped by everything around him. And the plight of the children I found particularly intriguing is perhaps the word. On the one hand, the children were protected, but there were at times in that kind of context that the protections didn't protect the children.
That's absolutely right. So I think the first day we were there, or the second day we were there, we witnessed a fight, and these prisoners were beating each other up. And then someone said, "Niño," and then there was that's a Spanish word for boy or child. And then along comes a kid, and they froze in these poses. One inmate was getting beaten up. I mean, you'd think that you'd run away once the other guy freezes, but no, you had to hold the pose, and the kid walked past, and then once the kid was around the corner, they resumed their beating. So they're really, really protective of the kids, and they're like this sort of really strange rules, but it doesn't always work. And unfortunately, there's been a number of cases of horrific acts of violence committed against young girls in there, and one 12-year-old girl was found to be pregnant living in the prison in 2012, and the authorities, again, this was international news, it was in the BBC, and the government promised to close this down, or at least to take the kids out, and they didn't. It's still business as usual.
Well, your interest in the human rights issues in the prison, San Pedro Prison, and Thomas's story then led you into other engagements in South America. Perhaps you could tell us about the what next, both for Thomas but also for yourself.
Sure. I mean, so obviously my interest has peaked in terms of human rights issues, social justice issues, and everything around the cocaine industry that gets corrupted by the incredible levels of money available. So this little clip is a small excerpt from an upcoming documentary called Wildlands. You get to see Thomas and I. So we actually went back into the prison last year as older men, 15 years older, no wiser. And this is the story of, we get to meet Thomas and see us in the prison and hear what happens next.
A piece of cake, but it's not, you know. A lot of stabbings over there happens. So it's dangerous as well, you know, although the kids and the women, they're living over there. I know many people, some of them, they were a friend of mine, they got stabbed over there to death. But I can say that I was lucky to be sent over there in San Pedro because I had a huge experience as well. I met nice people and I found my brother Rusty. I had time also to think about my life, you know. I came out as a better person now.
I was trying to pressure them to make them think that I was an international human rights lawyer so that they would find you innocent, because you were guilty of the first charges, but the second charges you were innocent, right?
Yeah, I was innocent.
Thomas's story was so incredible, I knew I had to write it. So we came to an agreement. Thomas would let me stay in his cell for 4 months, interviewing him about his crazy experiences. And in return, I promised to do everything in my power to get him out of there. So with help from Thomas's backpacker friends, I raised enough money to bribe 3 judges and secure Thomas's freedom.
So I went into the judges' chambers, I sat down in front of the judges, and I'm like, here's your money. Here it is, $4,000. See you later. And I just walked out.
Breaking the terms of his parole, we fled across the border and headed north to Colombia. It was here that I finished writing our book, Marching Powder. Eventually, Thomas moved back to Tanzania, but I stayed on for a further 7 years, researching my next book. During that time, I immersed myself in the cocaine trade, meeting members of terrorist organizations, as well as the US and Colombian elite soldiers fighting against them.
So sorry about that, Professor Crouch. I don't think you were there in forged human rights law 101 at the University of New South Wales, pretending you're a human rights lawyer.
No, I was teaching.
That's not part of the syllabus.
I was teaching property and equity and serious subjects like that. But I have a deep interest in legal history that has taken me into so many of the backgrounds and interstices of human rights issues. So I think we've got a glimpse of how things are happening for you. And Thomas, just tell us where Thomas is now, because and that will be then our segue for Kelly and more about the Colombia chapter.
Well, it has a happy ending. He'd been convicted of drug trafficking and he promised to get off the drugs, stop dealing. He did, and then he's moved back to his birth country of Tanzania and he has a son called Rusty.
Thank you. Kelly. It's my pleasure to introduce Kelly Brooke Nichols, who is our second panellist for this evening. Kelly is a human rights and humanitarian expert, and I think of particular note is that she has over 15 years senior leadership experience working for NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières. And her extensive time living and working in Colombia has left an indelible mark, I think very similar to the indelible mark on Rusty that we've heard. And I thought I would just open it now with you, Kelly, talking about your experiences in Colombia and particularly the human rights concerns that drew your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I got interested because I was working for the UN Independent Expert on Minority Rights, and she had a planned visit to Colombia, and I was doing some research on it. And like I think many Australians, I didn't actually know that much about Afro-Colombian population. I didn't know that that Colombia has the 3rd largest population of African descendants in the world. But I quickly learned from working with her and researching it, and I just met incredibly inspiring Afro-Colombian leaders and was really moved by the situation that they were facing. So when I then got a research grant, I moved to Colombia and subsequently got a job. And the job that I got was as a minority rights expert on a panel, on a commission to look to the impact of the war, specifically displacement. And I was focusing on minority rights. And so I traveled extensively throughout the country for a number of years interviewing Afro-Colombians. And Afro-Colombians have been disproportionately affected by the war. So as you may be aware, in Colombia, they had up until last year the longest ongoing war in the world, 52 years. And most people, obviously, we hear about Syria in the news for very, very good reasons, a lot, but people don't realize that Colombia has the second largest number of internally displaced people in the world, so 6.9 million. And the Afro-Colombian population who were brought to Colombia as slaves, just like in America and Brazil, etc., are disproportionately affected. While there's 10% of the population apparently are Afro-Colombians, 20% of the people who are displaced are Afro-Colombians. And because for a number of reasons, but largely because the places where they live are very strategic. They live along the riverways, on the coasts, so very, very strategic for the war, for the cocaine trade, as Rusty can talk about. And also their land is very rich, and so for both legal and illegal crops. So many of them have been pushed off their land. And to some extent, it almost impacts them more, because the Afro-Colombians, like some of you here might have had the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities, and they have that same kind of communal sense of land and of community. So families bring up children in community. Everything happens in community, and there's a very, very deep connection to the land. And so when they're ripped off that land and then forced to live in big cities, it has additional impacts. And where my book is set in Buenaventura is the major port city in Colombia, and I think it's kind of a very good example of the impact of the war on Afro-Colombians, because it might be where a lot of the wealth for the country comes in and out. Yet at the same time, it's totally forgotten by the government. You get there into the center and, it's all hustle and bustle. But as soon as you get out into the barrios, you get overwhelmed by this smell, and that's because the vast majority of it still don't have sewage. They still don't have access to running water, and this is, in a place that is bringing so much money into the country. They have about a 60% unemployment rate, and the violence is unbelievable. So when I was there, they had neighborhood to neighborhood. One was controlled by the paramilitaries, one was controlled by the guerrilla, and they would have these streets called names that to me seems ironic, like San Francisco and Manhattan. And these were the streets that marked, they were called no-go zones, because if you cross those, you'd cross from the paramilitary to the guerrilla zone. And I think, like Rusty, what really impacted me in general, but was the children. So in Buenaventura, both the children, you have this situation where you have kids who are like 6 playing guns, and we see that in Australia. But then you look, and children who are about 12 are already recruited. And I can remember being taken around Buenaventura's most dangerous neighborhoods, and they call them domino clubs. These kids would be sitting on every corner, and their job was to watch who entered and left. And so from that such a young age, they would be watching. And there were also things like torture houses and horrendous violence against young girls who all they did was, I don't know about you, but when I was 15, I didn't have great taste either. And they chose to be with someone who happened to be a guerrilla, and then they get taken by the paramilitaries, and horrendous things happen to them. And so the life of children there is particularly brutal, which is something I tried to show in my book, and I think Rusty obviously has shown very well in his.
And that whole issue around lack of hygiene, lack of water, lack of sewerage. All I can imagine is, where are the antibiotics? Where are the things that will protect the children and the mothers in dealing with those situations? It's one of the kind of hidden stories, I think, in challenges.
Well, to this day, just to add to that, to this day, the war might have ended, but a lot of the factors that have caused the conflict have not ended. So in places like Buenaventura, like Chocó, which are the Afro Colombian kind of bases, you still have absolute areas that are forgotten by the state, like I said, where you don't have running water, where you don't have sewage system, where unemployment is through the roof, where there's still high presence of the kind of cocaine groups that Rossi's been investigating, and these newly formed paramilitary groups. So there might be an official peace deal, but conflict continues, and the stuff that festers conflict still continues.
And of course, there are the child soldiers. So I thought I'll hand the mic over to you, Rusty, or I'll swap over. And then I know you've got another clip, but the whole story of the child soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of human rights challenges in Colombia. Kelly's mentioned the huge one, 6.8, 6.9 internally displaced people in a country of about 44 million. So that's more than 1 in 10. Imagine if 1 in 10 people that you knew had been displaced from their home. Just a bit of context here as well for those of you who aren't familiar with Colombian history, just so you know what we're talking about. Colombia is a very wealthy country. It's got a lot of oil, coal. They export flowers. Unfortunately, it's the world's biggest exporter of cocaine, followed by Peru and then Bolivia. But amazing natural resources, a really friendly, lovely population. If you have the privilege to meet Colombians, they're wonderful people and they don't take drugs. They look at cocaine in particular as really a horrific lower class drug, in perhaps the same way as we look at ice and heroin. And yet, obviously, a very large proportion, to my mind, of the ongoing human rights abuses in Colombia are associated with if not directly with the cocaine trade, at least in the areas where the cocaine trade is occurring, such as the critical strategic corridors like Buenaventura and Choco, which is up. So Colombia's in the northwestern tip of South America. It's got 2 coastlines, Atlantic and Pacific. It borders on 5 countries, Panama, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela and Brazil. So there's huge porous borders and 2 coastlines from which contraband can travel through. It's a highly mountainous country, which makes it really difficult to control from a military perspective. It's not actually a big country. It's only about the same size as New South Wales. But because of the mountainous nature of this country, it's really difficult to move around. There aren't really that many roads. It makes it, and also it's got desert, it's got Amazon jungle in one part, huge biodiversity, but it makes it ideal for kind of guerrilla warfare, low intensity guerrilla warfare. In the mid-1960s, basically Colombia was essentially an agricultural society with subsistence farmers who were sick and tired of the ruling class that controlled both the politics and the land and all the power system. So they decided to begin a peasant uprising. And that went on for a good 10, 15 years before the landowners who were being evicted from their land and being extorted and kidnapped as well, their family members would be kidnapped, began to fight back, and they formed private militias known as the paramilitaries. The paramilitaries then united under one banner, so they all arose independently, whereas the guerrilla was a central command insurgency. And the paramilitaries all banded together, and so that sort of started around the mid-70s. But what really fueled the rise of these 2 groups was cocaine trafficking, because to have a standing army, and the FARC guerrilla, the communist guerrilla at one stage, had between 17 and 20,000 troops. That's a massive army. If you look at the numbers of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Taliban, they were actually relatively small groups. And the paramilitaries, when they demobilized, apparently there were 30,000 of them. So a lot of people involved in this war, but basically a very small minority holding the entire country to ransom. Most Colombians are peace-loving people, friendly. They just want what we want. They want jobs, family, peace, and to live with dignity. And unfortunately, this civil war has torn the country apart. And further to what Kelly said, the other shocking statistic that I knew nothing about when I came to Colombia was that it had the 2nd highest number of child soldiers in the world. So I'm just going to play a little clip that gives you a bit of information and a look at or a listen to some of the voices of these child soldiers.
There are around 11,000 children involved in the civil war in Colombia. Overwhelmingly, these children come from impoverished rural backgrounds, and once they're joined up, they can't leave, and they witness torture and are forced to participate in combats and commit executions themselves.
De los niños y niñas que hay en los grupos armados son hijos de familias campesinas, donde la familia no tiene cómo responder por sus hijos y los abandonan. Una fiesta, cuando llegaron unos hombres ahí, nos cogieron a otro, a mí con mi hermano y otro chico, otros amigos ahí. Nos echaron una camioneta, llegamos a un campamento como a las 5 de la mañana. Tenía 15 años. Mi hermano tenía 16 años, o sea, 14 años, 12, pequeñitos.
So I'll just segue back to Kelly. So surprisingly, about a third of the child soldiers, so I said between 11 and 14,000, they do various jobs. You've mentioned a few of them, spies, logistics. About a third of them were girls.
Yeah, and I think, well, I want you to tell that story that you told the other night. I can start, but talking about, well, how about you tell that and then I'll talk about the impact of...
It's too early for that story.
Really? It's pretty harsh, yeah. Do you want to know? No. Okay. So yes, girls are active in both the paramilitary and the guerrilla, but also women in general have been victims of the war. There was a study done that between 2000 and 2009, 500,000 women were raped. And in addition to that, 80% never had not actually reported it to the authorities. And I mean, I saw it, and I'm sure you heard stories just about when the paramilitaries and the guerrillas come into towns, they use women as sort of as victims of war, as a way to show power. Yeah, it's quite heinous. But those girls, and maybe you can tell a bit without telling that story, about the girls who are actually inside the groups.
Yeah, so the treatment, I mean, there's some ironies there. They do commit horrific atrocities against the civilian population, but within the groups, at least on an official level, they had statutes to protect these girls. And a lot of the girls came from abusive, physically or sexually abusive family backgrounds and joined up to get away from sexual abuse. And sometimes they counted again. But once they join up, basically there's obviously more men than women, and so the girls are in demand, and they're usually young girls, and the commanders tend to be older guys. And so it wasn't uncommon to see sort of 45, 50-year-old guys going, I want to be with that 12-year-old girl. And even though theoretically they were consenting, you know, they're under the age of legal consent, at least in our legal system. And so also the men sort of controlled, they had the power of life and death over every single person there. So if they wanted something, they would get it. So basically, once these girls are in there, they were at the mercy of these horrific war criminals, basically. In the case of the guerrilla, obviously they don't want women becoming pregnant for a number of reasons. The first is obviously that they lose a combatant while a woman's pregnant, and then maybe she actually wants to be a mother and doesn't want to be in war anymore, and obviously may have a bond with the father, who's usually a member of the group. So you might potentially lose two combatants who suddenly decide they don't believe in the revolution anymore. So as soon as a girl begins her menstruation, they're given contraceptive injections, monthly contraceptive injections. If that contraception fails, and this is before they're even sexually active, by the way, just assume that they're going to be sexually active. It's not really a choice for them. But if that contraceptive injection fails, it's their fault, and they can be tried for crimes against the revolution. And they always undergo a forced abortion, usually in a really dirty rural clinic, sometimes in the jungle, and they can still be tried and executed for having committed the crime against the revolution. So often, particularly because it's a Catholic country and they don't believe in abortion, the girls will try and escape when they get pregnant, and then they get caught, brought back, and executed in a horrific manner. So every aspect of these kids' lives, and particularly the girls' lives, their sexuality, their whole sense of trust in humanity is controlled by these horrific leaders.
I think something that's interesting that both our books show in different ways is that it's not black and white how people are involved in Colombia. There's that line between what they say, victim and victimario is crossed, and it's in somewhere like Sierra Leone where they would take the children. In Colombia, it differs. You have situations where maybe somebody's father is killed, and then they will volunteer to go to a group. Or you might have a situation like in my book where a young kid doesn't have any money, no opportunities, and they offer him something that seems very light, like, spying, and then it escalates. So it's not so black and white like in Sierra Leone.
Yeah, I mean, when most people think of child soldiers, we think of Africa. Our minds turn to Bud Diamond and the recent warlords in parts of Africa. But in Colombia, I'd say about 95% of the kids that I interviewed, it's very difficult to get access to these kids while they're active and to get their stories out of them because they've lost a lot of faith in humanity. But so about 95% of them actually joined voluntarily. And when I say voluntarily, these are kids, it's illegal. Colombia has signed the protocol for the protection of children. There are no child soldiers in the Colombian government, army or police, by the way. These are illegal armed groups listed as FTOs or foreign terrorist organisations. But these kids join up because their lives, their level of poverty or their family life is so tragic. They often come from large Catholic families in really poor rural zones where, where they're hungry. And so if they're offered 3 meals a day, a uniform, a gun, and a sense of self-respect and power, often the boys join up because they want to hold a gun, they want to feel powerful. That seems like a step up to them. So this is something that I feel passionate about as well, because we hear a lot about terrorism, but we don't actually look at who the people are and why they join up. I'm not in any way sympathising with these causes, by the way. I'm just saying they're people, and it's interesting to try and understand what they go through and why they join up.
They are fairly confronting stories, and the altered realities that happen in those situations, either in the prison environment, in the environment of the child soldiers, altered realities. But I think what comes through in both the stories that you've been telling is the power of the individual and the importance of seeing those altered realities through the lens of the person, the child, the woman, the young boy, the convicted drug smuggler, to see the humanity in them. And I think we should open up now for some questions before we just have some last thoughts. Kelly, did you want to start?
I think what you were just saying is very important, and for both of us, and I'll speak for myself, that I wrote my book, A Reluctant Warrior, because I wanted to give a voice to the people, thank you, to the victims who are often not heard of. And at the same time, to celebrate the human rights defenders, because while for us, doing the work that we have both done in Colombia, it has an element of danger. The real danger is the human rights defenders who work in Colombia, and so many have been killed. And they're not people like many of us in this room who studied law or whatever and decided to be human rights defenders or journalists or whatever. They're fishermen and teachers and mothers, and they just see these crimes and finally say, I'm not letting this happen. They stand up for their community and they risk their lives. And while that has improved a hell of a lot, and last year there was 70 human rights defenders killed, that's still a lot. But back in the time then I was living there, that was thousands. So yeah, for me, that's what really moved me. And I don't know if you just...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are lots of different human rights abuses. The situation has changed. We must stress, by the way, it's a pretty dark stories we've been telling, but must stress that the war is officially over. The paramilitaries have demobilised. Last year, the FARC guerrilla agreed to peace, and they've just handed their weapons in recently. The Colombian president, Juan Manuel Santos, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So the future, this is the brightest point in Colombian history for the last 53 years, really. It's a great place to visit. Colombians are wonderful people. There's tourists flooding in, but there are still some huge challenges, and human rights is one of those areas. Union leaders also are often assassinated. They're just any community leader who does anything to stand up and go, hey, look, this was what's going on, is at risk of assassination. It's an ongoing threat. And it's great that Australians who could turn out on a night like this to come and listen to these sorts of stories. It's great that Australians are interested in other parts of the world. I really think it's a great thing. I'd like to add one more final thing. There's from my book, I'm donating 10% to an Australian foundation, which is completely independently run. nothing to do with me, but who do great work in Colombia that I've seen working with local partner organisations, and that's called CCF. That's their logo. Their chief, the head of the board of directors is here. His name's Greg Preuss. If anyone is interested in helping out in Colombia, I can guarantee this is a really good group that work in Colombia. And you might have some suggestions too for other different, depending on how you want to help out. But thank you all for coming along and questions, I guess.
Yes, let's open it up to questions, and we'll have an opportunity for some final words from each of our wonderful speakers. If you just put up your hand, we've got some roving mics around. At the back here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you both for your talk. I'm a big fan of both of you. So first of all, now that the FARC obviously has signed the peace agreement with the government, what do you think the human rights challenges are moving forward beyond this?
I can start. I think so like I said, human rights defenders still continue to be attacked. So there are newly armed paramilitary groups. So the main guerrilla groups and the main paramilitary groups are demobilized. But because of the pull of the cocaine industry, there are still smaller kind of illegally armed paramilitary groups that are involved in a smaller level in the cocaine trade. They continue to operate in a number of areas across Colombia, and so just I think about 3 weeks ago, an Afro-Colombian leader in Buenaventura was killed. The issues that I talked about earlier of kind of the structural racism as far as, lack of essential services. A lot of parts of Colombia are forgotten by the government. Impunity is a huge issue. Like, there has been so many gross human rights abuses, extrajudicial executions, assassinations, corruption up to the highest level, and there's such high levels of impunity. And I think in a society where, obviously by all sides, where there's that underlying impunity, it's a dangerous precedent to then, how do you move forward with that? Russell, do you want to add something?
Yeah, further to that, I see the biggest challenge is this. These two groups, essentially, if not controlled, at least they taxed and regulated the cocaine traffickers if they weren't directly involved themselves. They've always denied directly trafficking, even though there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. As part of the peace pact with the government, that issue was never on the table, nor was the millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars that they made from kidnapping and cocaine trafficking and extortion. So there's still lots of money out there floating around, and the fundamental supply and demand dynamic equation has not changed at all. So as these two groups exit the cocaine market and stop regulating and stop taxing it, there's a danger that, who is going to step in? There's a power vacuum there. And there's been absolutely no change since 1971, since Nixon declared the war on drugs. Cocaine use has actually gone up and down, and right now it's up. It's actually at the highest it's ever been. And coca production, despite all the different effort from manual eradication, fumigation, to interdiction, to extradition, to imprisonment, to criminalisation, cocaine use is at an all-time high, and coca leaf production is at an all-time high in Colombia. They actually, it was a well-meaning but misdirected program recently where they were offering subsistence farmers who were growing coca crops. They offered them money to pull it up rather than going in there by force, so trying to induce them to plant other crops, So what did they do? Well, we'll take the $1,000 per hectare for coca, and they started growing more and more to get the subsidy, right? So it actually this misguided program actually resulted in farmers running out and planting more crops. It's like marijuana; it's a weed basically. It can grow anywhere. So unfortunately, I think that to my mind is the biggest challenge for Colombia, is drug trafficking will continue. They're in an ideal position geographically and in terms of, political stability or instability to continue being big traffickers. Who's going to do it and who's going to control them? Next question.
At the front here. Just a minute, we'll get a microphone to you. Thank you.
With your talk today, and I loved it, I've seen a documentary on either the ABC or SBS only a short while ago about that prison, so I recognised everything you were talking about. Are you planning to go back there in the immediate present? Because I sort of fear for your life.
Yeah, I guess if you'd asked me 2 years ago when I knew this book was coming out, I was never going to go back. But I'm really optimistic about Colombia's future. I love the place. I really miss it right now. As I said, it's safer than it's ever been. When I got there, actually, I was working for the US government in counter-terrorism, in anti-kidnap. That was another one of the most horrific crimes I've ever seen. Colombia had between 3,000 and 4,000 kidnaps per year. So it's on average 9 or 10 per day. That's down to 1 per day, which is still one too many. It's under 300 this year of reported kidnaps. So if you've worked for the US government in anti-kidnapping in the country with the highest kidnap rate in the world, and with a former communist insurgency, it's probably, and then you're making public statements and writing a book, it's probably best to keep your head out of the country just for a little while. And Kelly, I think you've had quite a few run-ins from here and there.
I think I was more in danger when I used to be the executive director of the US office on Colombia, and we reported and we published a number of reports that were incredibly damning. The president of Colombia once named my colleagues and I, 3 of us who co-wrote a report, as terrorist sympathizers just before we landed in the country. And if you're called that just before you land in the country, that's like putting a target on your head. It was very scary. That was probably one of the trips I was most scared. But I've been saying to Rusty that we definitely have to get our books obviously into Spanish, and that we should try and do the circuit over there. I've just got to convince him to go. His mum is like going, no, don't talk to that girl again.
I did have a bulletproof car, but I had to give it back. You got a vest, okay.
Another question over here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was really, really good. I'm from South America, local. My family lives there. I was born and raised there, so that was very good. I'm from Ecuador. We have the same situation in jails like Bolivia has. And my question is, I'm thinking of going back there. I've been here for 7 years, and my plan's always been in my country, wanted to help, wanted to do whatever it takes to help them see what's better. And do you have a practical advice I can take with me to educate the community, or, help the children or women, or anything that I can, use?
Bueno, gracias por su pregunta.
Gracias.
I started off working in Ecuador. I worked in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Beautiful people. I suppose it's what issues you've obviously got a heart, you really want to help, but it's about what specific issue of human rights you're most passionate about. Because I know in your country, I was working on the big oil companies that were coming into your beautiful Amazon. But there's so many issues, obviously, so it's which one are you most passionate about, and how can you bring the knowledge that you've gained from living abroad and so forth to then share that and to empower people to speak up and stand up to corruption and so forth. And I suppose to use the contacts that you've now got abroad to better leverage that.
Right, so definitely inequality. There's a lot of poverty, a lot of unfairness. Governments are very corrupted, so it's hard to influence them and to have a voice when you're pretty much nobody. So
I work in advocacy and nobody's no one, and our governments care about people. And so it's always about thinking about what do they care about and who do they listen to?
Yeah.
And ultimately governments, even your government and governments a lot more corrupt than that, have to be voted in. Well, not all governments have to be voted in, obviously, but luckily yours does. So, I mean, people power has changed situations all over the world. But I can give you practical tips, which will take a bit longer than this later. I would absolutely love to talk to you, but I can absolutely guarantee that people can make a difference.
I think that's a really nice line to lead into the wrap-up, that people can really make a difference. And I think, just to make an observation myself, and then I'll give you the last words, but the redemptive power of individual intervention, and there is nothing glamorous about drugs. The toll that the drug trafficking is taking on people's lives is just horrific, and there is nothing glamorous about drugs. And when I was reading about Thomas's story, and that the ups and downs around the drugs in the prison, and the web of drug trafficking that went out from that and led Thomas there. But there was one passage in the book that I just want to share, as I think it's about the redemptive power that I spoke, and the observation that you just made, I think leads us there. This was the morning, I'm sure you will remember this very well, Rusty. This was the morning before Thomas was going into court to hear the sentence. This was the second of the matters, in fact, of which he was innocent. And he said, early morning, when I was delirious from tiredness and from thinking for so long, I made a promise to God. If he let me go free, I would never touch or sell cocaine in my life ever again. When I got out, I would try to help people and do some good in the world. After that promise to God, I made another one. If the judges found me guilty, I would escape. And if I couldn't escape, I would kill myself. But he was found innocent. He didn't need to escape, because through the help and intervention of Rusty and other friends, Thomas did lead on his own path of redemption. And to me, that's an expression both of the power of the human spirit, which I felt came through so strongly in the narratives that you shared with us tonight and in the books that you wrote. And it's the thing that we hang on to in commitment to doing something for those people, and using the human rights focus as the power of the law, the rule of law that is our defence against drugs, drug trafficking, and the evils it does to communities. So perhaps with that observation, could I invite you both to give a last word to our wonderful audience?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Croucher, and thank you all for attending. It's been a wonderful evening. I don't have that much more to add, other than to say, obviously, stories is also, telling stories is a really powerful way of changing the world. If you think about writing a book, or transmitting starting a radio station if you want, just passing on books and having discussions, travelling, sharing your stories with the world, interacting with the world, I think that increases people's understanding and tolerance. I know it's changed my life, and it's helped me attempt to change other people's lives in a positive way.
I think that's a beautiful point, and I think that's what we've both attempted to do, is that you can give people facts and facts and facts, but it's that human contact that changes their point of reference. And I hope through reading Rusty's book or mine or both, that changes your point of reference, and you want to find out more about Colombia. That hopefully you want to help the organisation that Rusty talked about, or other organisations working in Colombia, and that this has piqued your interest. So yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Professor Croucher and Australian Human Rights Commission.
Thank you. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming and sharing this conversation tonight. And I look forward to having the next Rights Talk, where we can share similar, very challenging, thought-provoking and deeply moving stories. So thank you all.